All right, so we have this last lecture, just a little bit of kind of final info that will help you move forwards into 505. It's not really something that pertains to any assignments that you're going to do necessarily. Maybe a little bit for your final presentation, but not a lot. It's mostly just to get you thinking about this idea in prep for 505. All right, and then I need people to let me know whether you want to meet in the library next week. Those of you that are on campus, let me know whether you want to meet or whether you would prefer to come and start one-on-one meetings. Distant students, if you've got questions about your anno bibs or your final presentation to the class, then start emailing me to make appointments for Skyping or for me to give you a call so that we can work through any questions you have on that. You don't want to go into a public presentation not quite sure that you're doing the right thing. That's pretty nerve-wracking. It's bad enough standing up in front of everybody if you haven't done that a lot. So you want to make sure that you're confident with what you're doing so that it's as comfortable as possible. Okay, all right, so synthesis of your reviewed literature. So we're looking at what will be for you guys your chapter 2, which is your mini literature review for your study, okay? And some of the techniques and ideas to make that piece of work flow well for your reader, all right? When I was in grad school, the lit reviews always had to be written in the third person. These days, even the APA manuals is starting to suggest that sometimes the first person is okay. I would still recommend keeping it more formal in the third person, but I'm a bit old-fashioned. So I would suggest that what you do is before you start writing, you check with the faculty member in charge of the class that you're taking and ask them whether first person is okay or do they want everything written in third person, right? Because as I say, right now there's not a rule really about that. It's sort of transitioning. And so just to be sure, don't assume that first person is going to be acceptable. Right? Okay, so we mentioned this way back at the beginning of the semester. Talked about that idea of plagiarism. And just to kind of review that and to solidify your ideas, you want to be able to use citations. Now, a citation is not the same as a reference, right? A reference goes at the end of the paper and it will give the reader enough information to direct them to find that resource if they want to, right? A citation is the little piece within the actual text itself where there's someone's name and a date. Right? So the point of the citation is to drive the reader to go to the reference list so that they can locate the resource if they want to. All right? In APA, the citation consists of always the first author, sometimes the whole list of authors, depending on where it is in the paper and how many authors there are, and always the year, unless you're repeating a a, 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 So the reason we use them is to help your reader go find the source, and so that you can't be accused of plagiarism, right? You can't be accused of copying someone's work if you cite it, is the theory. That doesn't mean you can cut and paste from an article, stick it in your writing, put a citation there, and then say, well, I didn't copy it because I put a citation. All right? That's not the point of the citation. It's just that if you're using someone's idea or you're supporting your information with someone else's research, you should give them the credit for doing that original piece of work. All right? You can't take credit for something that someone else did. Okay? So, you can use citations in a clever way because you don't have to summarize every paper you find on a topic. Right? If you have 4 papers, all of which discuss a particular idea, but one of them, the perspective is closer to what you're doing, you could summarize that one paper, but when you use the idea, you could open your, they're not brackets, what are they called? God, going home halfway through the semester to put my brain back in English mode. What are these things called? Parentheses, that's it, thank you. When you open the parentheses, you could put all 4 papers into the parentheses, and so your reader knows that there are 4 papers in the references that all talk about that concept. But you don't have to summarize all 4 papers. Right? So you can use them just to back up. So if we write, if your instructor is writing, but yes, okay, this idea is good, but you have to support the idea, you could use papers without necessarily summarizing them. Okay. Check your APA manual, because as usual, APA has lots of different formatting rules depending upon the type of citation and where it is in the paper, and how many times you've used it before, and all kinds of things. All right, and citations are one of those things that when you read papers from other disciplines, they change quite a lot. So some people have a number format rather than the names. Just if you read a biology paper, you'll quite often see 1, 2, 3, 4 through the paper, and then the reference list is not in alphabetical order, it's in numerical order. Right? I actually like the APA version the best when I'm reading. I find it the most user-friendly, but I guess that's because that's where my experience is, maybe. All right, so if you did the reading for this week, there's lots of really cute little pieces in the reading for this week to try to get you excited. And I just think one of the things I liked about this textbook is it does try to get you interested in writing, right? Interested in the idea of writing and of reading research. And you want it to be effective. The whole point of writing is to get your ideas out there to other people, right? That's why we write, not because we like the actual process and mechanics of writing. Some people do enjoy the actual process, but most of us write because what we want to do is allow other people to hear our point of view, right? And our ideas and our research results. So when you're writing your chapter 2, and you're trying to present the history, the background for your idea, then you don't want your reader to have to work really hard while they're reading your chapter 2, right? And so one of the things we want to do is think about continuity within the whole chapter, all right? And we want to funnel the reader towards your purpose statement. So although your purpose statement will be at the beginning of the chapter, you use the chapter, start the chapter out wide and narrow it down as you go through, so that by the end of the chapter your reader goes, oh, okay, I understand why they found this purpose question interesting. I understand how it fits with the current literature. I understand why it's unique, right? What makes it novel. Okay. So this idea of starting broad, so I'm going to look at cortisol and little children. The first thing I have to do is tell the readers what cortisol is. Right? So I start out wide. What is cortisol? Why is it important? What happens to cortisol when adults exercise? What happens to cortisol specifically in the half an hour after exercise or the day after exercise? Right? So we start out broad and then we start funneling down. What happens to cortisol levels with children in daycare? What information do we have about cortisol in response to exercise in children? Right? Not a lot, and most of it is in 10-year-olds or teenagers, or right? We didn't have anything in preschool. So you create your argument as you go through chapter 2, so that at the end of chapter 2, the reader is on the same page you are. Why is this question interesting, possibly important? Okay. That means that this idea of transitioning and exiting and entrance for paragraphs is important. So in the reading, they talked about the entrance and the exit to each paragraph. You have to transition from one paragraph to the next. One paragraph can't be paper A, the next paragraph paper B, the next paragraph paper C, right? So whilst you're going to create an annotated bibliography over the next few weeks, your next step is not to cut and paste your annotated bibliography into 10 paragraphs in your paper to hand in to Dr. Berkey, right? The next step is synthesizing that information that you've summarized into a continuous flow of argument for your question, right? Does that make sense? A little bit, not at all, right? So we can't have standalone paragraphs that just talk about one thing and then change to another thing without a transition from one to the other. So that's why the more you read, the easier the writing becomes, because the more you read, the more your brain starts to get the idea of how do I move from this paragraph to this paragraph, this idea to the next idea. How do I link those ideas so that the reader can see the flow of the information through the document? Really, you can use the entrance and exit concept for the whole paper, right? So, introduction, chapter 1 is your entrance into the paper. And chapter 5, if you wrote a thesis, would be your exit from the paper, it's your discussion. And at the end of the discussion, you would have a conclusion or a summary and ideas for future research. So you've got an entrance and an exit for the entire paper. Each chapter will have basically the same paragraph to start it out, because you have to say, in this chapter I'm going to do this, and I'll include these sections, and we are examining the purpose of, right? So every chapter has an entrance, and it should have a summary for the chapter, right? So each chapter has an entrance and an exit, and then each paragraph within the chapter should transition from the previous paragraph. So there should be some flow that makes it a lot nicer for the reader to follow, right? Remember, you write, you don't write for someone who is in your area of study. In my opinion, in my training, that's bad writing. When you read an article and the only way you could follow that article was if you've read 10 other papers before you read that article, that is not good writing. It may be okay because the journal is so highbrow no one else would read it anyway unless they had the background. So maybe from the journal's point of view that's acceptable because of the population they aim the journal at. But it wouldn't be generally accepted as a good piece of writing. Anyone should be able to pick your paper up and read it and at least understand the argument you're making, even if they don't understand the detail. Right? So, you've got to make your argument when you're synthesizing all this work that you find and you're creating your literature review, your chapter 2, you've got to make your argument for your question. All right? And that has to be very clear to the reader. So another piece of feedback you might get is, clarify why this idea supports your question or drives your question, right? And you've got to be ready to write this lots and lots and lots of time, right? You are not going to write chapter 2, hand it in, and never see it again. Or chapter 1 or chapter 3. Depending on how many people are in your class when you take 505, and depending on how much time Dr. Berkey has to allocate to 505, you're going to write it at least 2 or 3 times. If you write a thesis, you write them over and over again. I wrote my chapter 2 7 or 8 times for my dissertation. Generally at a master's level you wouldn't have to write it 7 or 8 times, but you're likely to have to write it 4 or 5 times, right? It's never right. It's never right. Okay? So it's one of those parts of grad school where this being an athlete and being competitive and having to be perfect kind of does you a disfavor, because it's never going to be right. The point is that you keep correcting it until the faculty member says, okay, enough now. You've done enough, right? That's what happens when you write a thesis or a dissertation. You hand it in, you hand it in, you hand it in, you hand. Eventually, your advisor says, all right, we can't do this anymore. You've made enough changes. You've put in enough work. You've earned the degree. So you will draft and draft and draft. When we scribble all over it, that doesn't mean you're awful. Actually, the more scribble you have can often be an indicator that it's a better paper, because if the paper is awful, it's very hard to give feedback. So if your writing is awful, if the idea is not great, or if the kind of literature or the way you're synthesizing the literature is bad, you may get less feedback, less scribble, because it's very hard to give feedback on something that's not good. Right? It's way easier to give feedback when there's something to work with. Right? So more scribble often means the paper is better than less scribble. So don't take offense if you get it back and there's scribble all over it. Right? The first time I got my chapter 2 back from my advisor, and she used to use a red pen, which is a reason why I never use red, because it freaked me out. I got it back and there was red pen. Oh, and I had worked so hard on this document, and I got it back and she had trashed it. And I opened it up, and I opened the drawer in my desk and I stuck it in there and I didn't look at it for 3 weeks, which was very bad. And I missed my next deadline, so I got into trouble. But I just could not, I was so shocked. Like, I wasn't expecting that, right? So expect it, because it doesn't mean that you did a bad job, okay? There's an old proverb, and I can never remember the exact wording, but it says something along the lines of, in order to make a long journey, the first step is to put one foot in front of the other. Right? If you find writing hard, the key is to get something down on paper. Okay? I've done it, I've been there, I have sat at the computer for hours and hours and hours and stared at a blank screen. And walked away and written nothing, and it doesn't help. Right? At some point, bite the bullet and put something on the paper. Right? Even if you do a flow chart or a table or bullet points and it isn't writing, get something on paper that you can bring to a faculty member and ask them to help you try to think through your ideas. All right? The reading has a very cute little piece, and I loved it when I read this the first time. They talk about writer's block, and they say, you know, you often hear people go, oh my God, I've got writer's block, I cannot put anything down, there's nothing coming, right? And they say, you know, really there's no such thing as writer's block. What you have is reader's block. If you can't write anything, you don't have enough ideas, you didn't read enough. So stop trying to write and go back and read another paper and then come back and try again. Right? So that's another idea. There's strategies. Think about your grammar. Pay attention to, as I said, the reading for this week takes you directly to places in the APA manual. We tend to be mean about the APA manual because it's this rule book and we all hate the rules. But there actually is a lot of very useful information in the APA manual to help you write more smoothly. Okay? So use those parts of the manual. Pay attention to grammar, sentence construction, and punctuation. They count. This is grad school. Using text speak is not okay. Forgetting a comma is not okay. Writing sentences that are 10 lines long is not okay. All right? You have to write appropriately for the level of degree you're now trying to be successful in. All right? Use grammar check. Use spell check. Use the graduate office, let me see what's it called, the Graduate Commons, that will help check your writing and help check your APA. Right? So there are plenty of resources around to help you get at least your grammar and your spelling correct. It's not okay to hand something in that has those kinds of errors all over the place. You guys, I know that English may not have been very good at school, and I know your English classes may or may not have been very good at your university, but this is great.